Okay, so in this section, we're going to be talking about some of the fundamentals of statistics. So to start with, we want to talk about what is data. So data for us is just the information from the world around us. So it's just information out of the world, essentially. But really, it's coming from different places. So it's information coming from observations, counts, measurements, or responses. But really, data is just information that we gather from the world around us. So some examples of data that we have. So people who eat 3 daily servings of whole grains have been shown to reduce their risk of stroke by 37%. Or 70% of the 1,500 U.S. spinal cord injuries to minors result from vehicle accidents, and 68% of those were not wearing a seatbelt. So data is literally just the information from the world around us. So statistics, when we talk about that, what we're talking about is really what we do with the data. So how we use that data to make some claim about the world or about whatever it is we want to know. So statistics is how we use the data, essentially. So it's how we use the data or what the data tells us. That lets us make a decision. That's what statistics are. So the formal definition of statistics is it's the science of collecting, organizing, analyzing, and interpreting data to be able to make a decision. But for us, it's just how do we use that data to make some decision? How do we use the data to make a claim or to support a claim? That is what statistics is. It's just how we're using the data. So first off, before we can talk about how we use the data and can get into that, what we need to know is how do we get this data? So to start with, ask yourself those 5 questions that you used to ask all the time back in middle school. So who, what, when, where, why, and how. So think about those questions. We really want to answer a lot of these same things to be able to design a good study. So to start with, where do we gather our data from? So we have to start off looking at individuals. So these individuals, these are the who. So this is who we want to study. Who do we want to know information about? It's who you're interested in. So it's your people or objects that you're including in the study. So I say objects because normally when you hear individuals, you think of people, but it doesn't have to be a person. You could be doing a study on which car color is most popular, for example, and in that case, your objects or your individuals would be the cars that you're looking at. So individuals do not have to be people, but the individuals, this is who you want to study or what you want to study. The variables, this is your what. So it's what you want to measure or what you want to know. It's the information that you want to know. So this is your characteristic of the individual that you're measuring. So for example, if I'm doing a study about which car color is most preferred by people, then one variable I would want to measure would be car color. Another one, maybe I want to look at how car color can be preferred based on the age of a person. So for example, maybe older people like white cars, whereas younger people like red cars. So that's the variables. So I might pull age as a variable. So color of the vehicle, age of the owner, location, type of vehicle, etc. So those would be different variables that you would collect. So when we're talking about the individuals, we break our individuals into two different groups, really. So we start off looking at the population. This is the group that we really care about. This is who we ultimately want to say something about. So it's who we want to make our decision or our claim about. But the important thing to know is your population is every single individual that you're interested in. It's all of the individuals. So it's the entire group. Now, often, populations are going to be huge. We can't physically study an entire population because of lots of different reasons. And we'll talk about some of these reasons later on when we talk more in depth about a sample. But just know it's normally going to be impractical to study a population as a whole. So to make it easier on us to study a population, we're going to pull a sample of the population. So a subset or a piece of the population. So our subset is just a piece of the population. This is usually who we will actually study, or who we'll actually usually get the data from. So pictorially, so if you're a visual learner, here's kind of a picture, a Venn diagram of the relationship between a population and a sample. So ultimately, in this picture, the whole larger oval is the population, but the smaller oval, that's just a piece of the population. So your sample comes from the population. Sample is just a piece of the population. It's just a subset of it. It's a small group inside the population. Now, we'll talk about later on in the course how we build these samples, how do we choose people to be in the sample. But really what we want to have happen is we want this sample to look as close to our population as we can while being a smaller group. Now, we want large sample sizes, but we still want this sample to look like the population. So we'll talk more about that in coming sections. So things to remember. The population is your whole group. It's the group that you want to know about. The characteristics of the population we call parameters. So parameters, we typically don't know these. One of the biggest goals of a parameter in this course, what we're going to do, our big goal is to be able to estimate the value of a parameter. So that's what we're working towards. We want to be able to estimate the value. We don't know the parameter because we usually cannot pull data from the entire population. Parameters are fixed though, because they're going to be the same for that population no matter what. Parameters stay the same for a population. They are fixed. Now if the population changes, then you have a different population, you're going to have a different parameter. But at any point in time, if your population is the same as it has been, it's going to have the same parameters. A sample, that's a part of the population. So it's just a part of the group. The sample, you do know the information about. So we know the information about the sample, whereas the population, we want to know the information. So a lot of times what we're going to do is we're going to use the sample because we know that information about them to then make a claim or to verify a claim or to estimate a parameter about the population. So characteristics of our sample, we call them statistics. So be careful, we're using statistics in two different ways here. So we talk about statistics as that overarching science or the overarching process of how we collect data and analyze data and interpret data to make a decision. But we also use it to describe characteristics of our sample. Now, the statistics that are characteristics of our sample we know these statistics because we know the information about the sample. And statistics are going to change with your sample. So if you pull different samples from the same population, you might have a different sample mean, for example, and we'll talk about what the sample mean is in Chapter 3. But you might have a different mean for a different sample within the population, and that's okay. So statistics change based on the sample. So let's look at a data set and see if we can figure out who the population, the sample, would be. And then let's just talk about the data set a little bit. So in a recent survey, 1,500 adults in the United States were asked if they thought there was solid evidence of global warming. So 855 of those adults said yes. So who is our population in our sample? So a lot of times it's easier to start with the sample. So let's start in this case with the sample. And then we'll see if we can figure out who the population is. So your sample, this is the small subset of the group. This is who you're actually asking the information of. So in this case, who did we ask? So here it says 1,500 adults in the United States were asked if they thought blah, blah, blah. So the 1,500 adults who were asked, that is our sample. So our sample is the 1,500 U.S. adults. And then our population, we extrapolate that out, so you just change one little word. So your population is the entire group. So who do we want to know the information about? So we gather the information from the 1,500 adults, but who we really want to be able to extrapolate this to, what do we really want to know it about, is all of them. So all U.S. adults in this case. So what you do to get the population is you change one little word. Your population is always going to be all of something. So the population in this case is all the U.S. adults. So I mentioned we normally cannot gather data from the entire population, but every once in a while it is possible. So a census is a study where the data is obtained from every single member of the population. So a census is a study using a study of the entire population. So in other words, you're not pulling a sample, you're actually going out and gathering the data from the entire population. Now, censuses are rare. In the United States, for example, we only do a census once every 10 years. So censuses are very rare for good reason. Most of the time, censuses are very costly because populations are huge. And it's very time consuming and difficult to ensure that you're getting the data from everybody. So a census, you're gathering data on the entire population. That's a census. So parameters and statistics. So parameters are just numerical descriptions of a population characteristic. So parameters start with a P. And population starts with a P. So that should help you remember population goes with parameters. Parameters are descriptions of a population characteristic. Now for our purposes, parameters are going to usually be written as Greek letters. So some common parameters we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about mu, sigma, sigma squared. We might talk about the parameter rho later on in the course if we have time. So these are just parameters. So parameters for us, an easy way for you to recognize a parameter, look for the Greek letter. That will tell you you're dealing with a parameter. So we're talking about something based on population data. A statistic, we're talking about sample data. So just like parameter starts with P, should remind you that it's population. Statistic is a numerical description of a sample characteristic. They both start with S. So these we're usually going to write as in Arabic letters. Now when I say Arabic letters, these are the letters of our alphabet that we're used to seeing every day. So some statistics we'll typically talk about. So X bar. So just a regular old X with a line over it. Or S. Or S squared. Or P. These are statistics that we'll talk about as the course goes on. So an example of a parameter would be the average age of all the people in the United States. Notice that word all is in there again, cluing you in that this is population data. Whereas a statistic might be the average age from a sample of 3 states. So we know there are more than 3 states in the United States. So then, if we're only looking at a sample of 3 states and getting their average age, that's going to be a statistic because it's coming from a sample data set. The majority of our data that we're going to talk about in this course will be sample data. So let's look at a study and see if we can figure out, is this a population parameter or is this a sample statistic? So in other words, is this population data or is this sample data? So a recent survey from a sample of college career centers reported that the average starting salary for petroleum engineering majors is $83,121. So in this case, we know this is coming from a sample of college career centers, right? So because it tells us this is a sample, we know this is going to be a statistic. Okay, so let's look at one more example of a study and see whether or not we have a parameter or a statistic. So the 2,182 students who accepted admission offers to Northwestern University in 2009 have an average SAT score of 1442. So when we're looking at this, it tells us the 2,182 students. So we can assume this is every single student who accepted an offer of admission to Northwestern University in 2009. So in this case, this is our population. So it's all the students who accepted an admission offer. So it doesn't tell us that this is some of the students, right? It's saying it's the 2,182 students. So it's all of the students who accepted the admission offer. So this is population, which means that average SAT score is a parameter. So let's look at the 2 types of statistics. So statistics breaks down into 2 different groups. So we have descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. And really what happens is we use descriptive statistics to get inferential statistics. So our descriptive statistics, this is basically what we do when we first get the data. So with descriptive statistics, what we're doing is we're organizing, summarizing, and displaying that data. So we're putting it into tables, we're putting it into charts, we're calculating averages. Whereas inferential statistics, that's where we're using that data that we collected to make our conclusion about the population. So in other words, those averages we got from our data, doing our descriptive statistics, we're going to use that to say something about the population, for example. So descriptive statistics is just basically how we display the data, how we look at the data, how we describe our data. So think of descriptive statistics as describing. So describing the data. And inferential statistics, we're inferring population information from the data. So those are the 2 branches of statistics we're going to talk about in this course. So, for example, a large sample of men aged 48 was studied for 18 years. For unmarried men, approximately 70% of those were alive at age 65. For married men, 90% were alive at age 65. So, our descriptive statistics in this case, so the descriptive statistics, 70% alive at age 65. Married men, so that's single men. Married men, 90% were alive at 65. So the descriptive statistics are strictly describing your data. An inferential statistic is going to be something that you say based on that. So looking at those descriptive statistics, we can draw the conclusion that married men live longer. So you have 90% of married men alive at 65 versus 70% of unmarried men alive at 65. So that's something we can draw from that data. So your inferential statistics are the conclusions that you draw based on your descriptive statistics, based on your data.